The dreams, the hopes, resilience of a people continue as we forge forward in freedom, justice, equality, through exploring the many ways to experience the infinite life, the light, and the love of the divine beyond the cemented walls of this sanctuary. We have been called to embrace the ever-widening circle of the divine through welcoming and celebrating the stranger within and within others. We have celebrated and embraced what makes our nation great during our Black History Month by recognizing the contributions of Black and white folk, as well as acknowledging the bitter struggles and sacrifices African Americans have bared and continue to bear for the right to sit at the table of equality and equity called the American dream. This morning we conclude our month of embracing the journey to freedom and justice through the words of our guest speaker, Ms. Faithe Norrell. Her biography is thick with a generational family history of service. She comes from a family of educators, ministers, and missionaries. She retired from teaching in 2017 after 42 years as an educator in the public schools of Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles, New Orleans. 27 of those years teaching in the Richmond public schools. She has deep roots in this community and history in our Richmond area. Her paternal grandfather, Albert V. Norrell, born and enslaved, was the first Black educator to teach in Richmond public schools. Though the school named after him is closed, the building in the north side of Richmond remains a testament to a time that a school was named after African American when Black folks were still being denied the right to vote or sit at a lunch counter of their choice. My children attended that school, and my grandchildren attended that school. And I am very proud that I feel like I'm part of that legacy of history. In addition to her passion for history, Ms. Norrell is a multi-talented artist from canvas painting to wearable art. She has had several art showings at the Crossroads Art Center in Richmond. This mother of two says the best part of retirement is spending time with her adult son and daughter and pursuing her love for Black history. Her thirst for historical stories and dedication to tell those stories led her to volunteer at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center. With her current position as Education and Programming Coordinator, we are delighted to have her share the journey. There will be a video from Dr. Harris, welcome video for Dr. Harris, and immediately follow will be the remarks by Ms. Norrell.
Hi, I'm Dr. Monroe Harris, President of the Board of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. It certainly would be my pleasure to be there with you today, but as we live in an era of digital content, I'm happy to know that my virtual greeting is acceptable, and I look forward to meeting you sometime very soon. That said, thank you for visiting the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. Our mission is to provide, develop, and partner in the creation of educational resources, services, and opportunities to promote and advance understanding of the history and culture of Black people and African Americans here in the Commonwealth. 2021 marked 40 years of doing just that. Through our exhibitions, educational programs, cultural events, and community engagement, the museum has served as the primary source for Virginia's Black history. We are beginning the next 40 years of our journey by taking our assets outside of these four walls and meeting the challenge of fulfilling our mission within the confines of our physical footprint by actively seeking opportunities for place-based initiatives to present Black history as part of our overall shared history. We are building relationships and partnerships with mission-aligned organizations so that our collaborative efforts will provide greater access to Virginia's Black history that has, in many cases, been pivotal to our history and the world's inclusive history. We are in a unique position of having relevant content such as artifacts, art, historically significant documents, and images that can be utilized to provide services within our current facility, as well as through virtual and augmented reality activities, portable programming, and a mobile museum, all for the sole purpose of promoting and advancing the understanding of the history and culture of Virginia's Black people. The educational opportunities we will offer for school children and youth will be valuable additions to the classroom curriculum. A virtual reality experience and other enhancements to our permanent collection are part of our growth plan. This work will inform how we make our services accessible to students across the Commonwealth. There is so much more that I can share with you about the museum and what lies ahead for us. It is my hope that you will be encouraged enough from this brief message to become a member if you're not already a member. And if you are a member, please make good use of your membership. Thank you for your presence here today, and again, welcome.
So Dr. Harris was saying we come outside of our walls, and so that's why I'm here today. I certainly want to thank Reverend Gail and Reverend Georgia. That is not the bio I sent you. I don't want y'all to think that I did all that, but thank you so much. What a beautiful story that you told. And I also want to thank Henry and Les for inviting me here today. As Henry said, and we texted on the way in this morning, it's a wonder we even have a mind, because, you know, Black History Month is when people feel like they need to check the box. And we have been so busy at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia this month that we are both glad to see February 28th come. But I'm even happier to be here with you today to bring a message from the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. So the building was built in 1895. It was built as the Lee Street Armory, and it was built to accommodate the 1st Battalion of the Black Volunteers, or the militia. So it was amazing that the building was even there. There was, following the Civil War, Reconstruction came quickly and left quickly, only about 12 years. But during those 12 years, 3 amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment that freed enslaved people unless they were in jail. And many of them were rounded up for loitering and then just put in a different form of slavery to help build the infrastructure of the South that was burned during the war. The 14th Amendment granted them citizenship because they were not considered citizens. They weren't even really considered people. They were more chattel. And then the 15th Amendment gave Black men only, because no women had the right to vote until the early 20th century, but it gave Black men the right to vote. So with that vote came their voice. And many of them were elected to council and committees of council, and led by John Mitchell, one of my ancestors, Edinburgh Archer, and many others. There was a plea to have the Armory building built. And in fact, in 1895, Armstead Walker and his brother, Armstead was married to Maggie Walker, and Maggie Walker was the great-great-grandmother of my children, Mick and Liza. So Armstead Walker was given the contract to build the building, so that was unusual. He had 2 really unusual jobs. We hear a lot about Maggie Walker, but Armstead was a brick contractor, a master mason. So if you drive around Richmond, any old historical buildings, and you see round brick, then that was more than likely done by the Walker brothers. He also was employed by the postal office, the postal service, which was also very unusual for a black man to have that job at that time. So the militia came there into that building, and they practiced their maneuvers in case they were called in for a civil uprising, but they were also able to go into war. So in 1898, they were called to come serve in the Spanish-American War. But they said, you know what, we will come, but we want a black commander. Well, in 1895 or 1898, when the Spanish-American War started, we had come out of Reconstruction, and we were in Jim Crow. So the governor said, no, no commander, no black commander. So they said, no commander, no serve. So they disbanded. The building was turned over and became a school first, and then it became many annexes to first Armstrong High School when it was on Lee Street, and then later Benjamin Graves Junior High School. And then the building caught on fire. The city did put a new roof on the building and stabilized it. I used to teach at William Fox, so we're going through that same process right now. And then the building just sat vacant. Black History Museum was founded by a man named Carol Anderson, who in 1981 had a dream. His dream was to have this Black History Museum celebrating all of Black Virginia. We're not just the Black History Museum of Richmond, we celebrate the whole state. It took him about 10 years to accumulate enough artifacts to open. And he opened in what was the old Rosa D. Bowser branch of the Richmond Public Library. Now I'm going to tell you, and I don't look it, I'm 71 years old, but, and I tell you that because I was raised in the 50s during segregation. And then I was also on that first tier of people, much like Reverend Georgia, who desegregated. She was sharing her story of how she helped to desegregate J. Sargent Reynolds and what a battle it was for her to complete her nursing training because of these walls that were set up and these unimaginable barriers that we couldn't jump over, because every time, like the poll taxes and the test that you would take to become registered to be a voter, how can you guess the number of bubbles in a bar of soap? But that was one of the questions that was asked. So these unimaginable hurdles were set up. So I was able, luckily and fortunately, to attend Albert V. Norrell Elementary School. I'm the only grandchild that actually did go there the whole time. But Albert Norrell only went to 5th grade. So I was in the first class to desegregate what is now Barack Obama, but then it was Jeb Stuart Elementary School. And then I was in about the 3rd class to go to Chandler, which is now Community. So yes, we were right there on that front line of breaking down these barriers. But I want to just go back again to the Black History Museum and talk a little bit about what you'll see when you come there. We have technology that is very often like this. But it is designed to give you a step back and listen to stories that inspire. That's our mission, to tell the untold stories, the undertold stories, and the forgotten stories. So when you come, our touchscreens that are throughout our permanent exhibition give you many of those stories. We begin with a story about the building itself and how it came to be and the many uses that it's had. Then in our permanent exhibition on the first floor, we have 2 galleries. The first one talks about emancipation, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. And it gives inspiring stories of Elizabeth Keckley, who was the seamstress and confidant of Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. It tells you about Maggie Walker. It tells you about John Mitchell, the fiery editor of the Richmond Planet newspaper. And then in our second gallery, in our permanent exhibition, we talk about civil rights and the desegregation of schools. And we talk about 2 attorneys from Richmond, Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, but we also tell about a young woman named Barbara Johns, who as a teenager asked for a better school building for her students. And that building was in Prince Edward County, in Farmville, Virginia. And so the principal kept saying, we'll be patient, we'll get you a new school building. But Barbara John said, no, I'm tired of waiting. So as a teenager, she staged a walkout of her school. So they concocted this great plan. They had the principal call downtown for a meeting that really wasn't, and Barbara and her fellow classmates walked out of that school. It was the Robert Russa Moton High School, and they walked out. And that led to a boycott against the city, and Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson went down to Farmville, and they filed a suit against the county, and eventually that suit, along with many others, became Brown versus the Board of Education, which led to the legal desegregation of schools. But at that time, we had a governor named Governor Byrd, and he said, we will do it with all deliberate speed, like never. So so schools were legally desegregated in 1954, but it wasn't until I just said that 1960, 61, when we first started really desegregating schools here in Richmond, Virginia. Prince Edward County decided we won't desegregate at all. We will close our schools rather than desegregate. So the students in Farmville very often, either if they didn't have a relative that they could go and live with, they just were denied education for about 5 years. Many white academies were set up so that the white children continued to get their education, but these students were just lost. You know, we can understand now with COVID what's done to our children when the schools closed, but they had no opportunity, obviously, for virtual learning. So, you know, an education denied is a future that doesn't get to bloom. So then we also have a statue in that room, the maquette you saw in the beginning of Arthur Ashe. One of our board members was Paul DiPasquale, famous sculptor around town. So he granted the museum the ability to house that top of the Arthur Ashe statue in that room. And then the highlight of our first floor permanent exhibition is a timeline of Black history facts from ancient Egypt through the time that the museum opened in 2016. I like to point out that in 1619, to visitors when they come in, I like to point out that in 1619, the first Africans were brought to the North America. Slavery had been existing in South America and Mexico for over 100 years, but the first Africans were brought to the shores of Old Point Comfort in Hampton in 1619 and then brought over to Jamestown. And I try to make sure they understand that these people were not slaves. These people were artisans. I was talking just before service about Benin statues, bronze statues being made in Africa in the year 900. They were historians, they were griots, they were mathematicians. The first library in the world was established in Egypt on the continent of Africa. So what they were people that were put into a system of slavery. So we call them enslaved. We don't refer to them as slaves anymore. They were enslaved people. In the museum, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. So we do have our 40th exhibition called Forging Freedom, Justice, and Equality, and it touches on about 7 areas, including in my father's house. We talk about famous churches that were established during Reconstruction. We talk about famous educators and bankers and newspaper people. So we do hope that you'll come and take a tour. As Reverend Gail and Reverend Georgia said, we will be down in the reception area after service with membership forms because we are a private museum. So we do rely on grants, but we rely on memberships to keep us afloat and keep us always thinking of new and innovative programming, and we do. So we do hope that you'll come. But while I have this microphone, I want to talk a little bit about my personal story. I have an interesting story, and it's not unique to me. I don't know how many of you all have read the book Yellow Wife or heard of the book Yellow Wife. It's a historical fiction. It is not the biography of Mary Lumpkin. There is a biography called The Devil's Half Acre. But in the book Yellow Wife, it describes many atrocities of slavery. Every time I think it's horrible, that I've heard the worst, I even learn more. So in this story, it talks about women who were mixed race, although miscegenation was against the law. Many enslavers had children with their enslaved women because it wasn't considered rape. They were their property. They had no agency. They just were at the will of their enslaver. My grandmother and my great-grandmother were yellow wives. So our enslaver was a man named Robert Pleasant Archer. And like many people that were in Virginia especially, and further south, agriculture wasn't the main order of business because they had depleted the soil. So they turned to the breeding business. Here in Richmond, at the Port of Richmond, down in Shockoe Bottom, over 300,000 enslaved people were sold in what they call the downriver slave trade. And they were sold downriver to work in the thriving work camps, what we call plantations, once in South Carolina, Georgia, all the way over to Texas. So they needed a big workforce. Louisiana. I don't know if anybody's ever visited the Whitney plantation in Louisiana that tells the enslaved story of living on that plantation. But I'll never forget the tour guide or the docent that said no matter your age, your life expectancy was no more than 10 years after you arrived because of the brutal conditions there. And the owners didn't really care, because those enslaved people were insured, just like their cattle and their homes. So if they died, they just were, paid their insurance policy on them. So my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather was a man named Robert Pleasant Archer. He and his cousin, William Seeger Archer, went into the breeding business and slave trading business. So they bought a woman, a mixed-race woman in New Orleans, Louisiana, walked her over to their work camp in Chula, Mississippi, and then eventually brought her up to Chula, Amelia County, where they had a very large work camp that spanned both Amelia and Powhatan counties. So that woman's name was Kate. And as we were doing our research, we found this Kate in 1820, and then we found this Kate in 1860 that was still bearing children. We just couldn't understand this. So we eventually found out that Robert Pleasant Archer had children with Kate, and his daughter was named Amy. And then he had children with his own daughter, Amy. And Amy gave birth to Kate, who was my grandmother. So that was a hard story for us to hear, but very much like Mary Lumpkin, something that was meant for bad turned into good, because I'm here today to tell that story. And I tell that story with no animosity to Robert Pleasant Archer or any of the enslavers, because that was the practice of the day. So I can't hold anger and bitterness in my heart and want reconciliation. I have to let that go, and I just have to know that, that's why I'm here today, and that was the path that God had me arrive here. And then Kate married my grandfather, Albert Norrell, and now I hear of the many generations of children that came through the halls of Albert Norrell Elementary School. He actually started teaching at the age of 16. He taught for 66 years, and for 133 consecutive years, one of his direct descendants taught in Richmond Public Schools until I retired in 2017. So he was a contemporary of Maggie Walker. So, you know, in Richmond, if you know anything about the Richmond way, we keep things close together. So Maggie Walker's great-grandson is the father of my children. We're divorced, but we're still great friends, and we raised two amazing children, Mick and Liza, who are doing so well. Liza is working with Virginia Tourism, and Mick is working in New York City. So we're very proud of our heritage on both sides of our family, and we're just so pleased that we can continue to share their stories, that we walk in their footsteps, that we know that to whom much is given, much is expected. So we have passed that thought down to our children and the other great-great-great-grandchildren of all of those early newly enslaved people that had the courage to come out of such a brutal system, to know that education was the key, and through education they were able to found newspapers. Albert Norrell was one of the founders of the Richmond Planet newspaper. You know, Maggie Walker was known as a banker, but she was also such an advocate for women. She established the St. Luke Herald newspaper, the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, and the St. Luke Emporium. And in all of her businesses, she made it a point to employ black women, because she knew that their only opportunities were usually in servitude, and she wanted to make sure that they came out of that they got jobs and they were trained. So she also fought for women's rights. She was the first black woman to run for a statewide office along with John Mitchell on the Lily Black ticket. And so we're just so humbled at the museum and in our personal stories to be able to say what we've overcome, what we had to get over, but also what we want to achieve. And so I just feel that if we look into ourselves, if we get to know each other, when I look at this congregation, I recognize that the more people think we're different, when we really look into it, the more we have in common. So we have to look at commonalities, and we have to take the time and get to know people of all faiths, all genders, all races, all religion, because we are all God's children, and that's the most important thing. So I thank you again today. I don't want to go over my time, but I do thank you so much for having me here and to be able to tell just a few of the hundreds of stories of inspiration that we have at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. Thank you.